Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are going to untangle a legal knot that affects just about anyone with a neighbor. Easements. And we're going to break it all down using a simple story about a farm, a landlord, and a tenant whose friendly little deal is about to get really complicated. I mean, it's a classic problem, right? You think you have an understanding, and then boom, a gate is locked, a path is blocked, or a sign gets torn down. Well, the law actually has a very specific tool for these disputes, and it all comes down to this incredibly powerful right called an easement. So to really see how this works in the real world, let's meet our two characters. We've got Andros, who owns a house and the farm right next to it, and then there's Benny, the tenant farmer who's leasing the farm from Andros. They start off as good neighbors, but believe me, things are about to go south. Their whole argument boils down to three things. First, there's a billboard for farm produce that Andros suddenly tears down. Second, a storage shed that Andros decides he wants to keep all to himself. And third, a handy shortcut across the farm that Benny all of a sudden blocks off. So, how on earth does the law figure out who's in the right? Okay, to solve this mess, we need to open up our legal toolkit. And the main tool we're going to use is this very specific right, the right for one person to use land that actually belongs to someone else. And that right is called an easement. Now, that word proprietary is absolutely key here. It means the right isn't just a personal promise. It attaches to the land itself. It's a serious, heavy-duty right that can stick around through generations of new owners. And that's what makes an easement completely different from just getting permission, which the law calls a license. You know, a license is just a personal, flimsy permission slip. It can be torn up at any time. An easement, on the other hand, is a rock-solid right that binds anyone who buys the land later, and you better believe it's legally enforceable. So you can't just slap the label easement on any old arrangement. Nope. To qualify, a right has to pass four very specific tests that were set up in a famous English court case called Re Ellenborough Park. Let's run through them really quick. First, you need two properties, a dominant one that gets the benefit and a servient one that carries the burden. Second, they have to be occupied by different people. Third, and this is a big one, the right has to actually help the dominant land itself, not just be some personal perk for the owner. And finally, the right has to be clear enough that you could actually write it down in a formal deed. Okay, so we know what an easement is, but how do they pop into existence? Well, in a perfect world, they're created expressly, written down, clear as day in a legal document. But more often than you think, they aren't. And that's when the courts have to step in and decide if an easement should be implied from the situation. And when we're talking about these implied easements, there's a huge difference we have to get straight. Is a right being granted to the person buying or leasing the land, or is it being reserved by the person selling it for their own use? The law is way more generous to the person getting the land. It's incredibly tough for a seller to later claim they meant to keep a right for themselves if they didn't bother to write it down. All right, with our legal toolkit ready, let's put on our legal goggles and head back to the farm. We're going to apply these rules and solve Andros and Benny's disputes one by one. First up, the billboard. So here's the deal. Andros used that billboard for the farm before he leased it to Benny. Then, after Benny moves in, Andros just tears it down. Can Benny actually force him to put it back up? Does he have an implied right, an easement, to have it there?
Let's break it down. The right to advertise obviously benefits the farm business, so it passes the basic tests. But the crucial fact is that the billboard was being used continuously right when the lease was signed. And this triggers a really powerful legal shortcut. It's called Section 62 of the Law of Property Act 1925. This rule is like a legal magic wand. It says that when land is sold or leased, any perks or privileges being used with that land can automatically get upgraded into full-blown easements.
So you guessed it, Benny wins round one. Because that billboard was already in use, Section 62 just swooped in and automatically gave him an easement to keep it there. Okay, next problem, the shed. Before the lease, Andros only used it occasionally to store some farm tools. After Benny takes over the farm, he starts using it, and Andros tells him to get out. Does Benny actually have a right to use that shed? Now, the timeline here is fascinating. At first, no, Benny had no right. Andros' use was just occasional, and that's not enough to create an easement from day one. But then, Andros gave Benny personal permission, a simple license to use it. The real game changer, though, came when the lease was legally renewed. That renewal counts as a new formal conveyance, and it lets Section 62 work its magic all over again, upgrading that flimsy personal license into a permanent rock-solid easement. And this is a brilliant example of how a temporary, informal okay can suddenly morph into a permanent, legally binding right, all because a lease was renewed. So yes, Benny gets to use the shed.
All right, finally, let's flip the script and look at it from the landlord's side. Andrews used to take a shortcut through the farm to get to town. Now that he and Benny are fighting, Benny blocks it. So can Andrews, the guy who granted the lease in the first place, claim he has an impliedly reserved right to keep using that road?
For Andros, the legal bar is incredibly high. There's a basic principle that you can't give something with one hand and then take it back with the other. To keep a right he didn't write down, Andros has to prove it's an absolute necessity. We're talking his house would be totally landlocked without it. But he has another way to get to town, even if it's longer. Well, too bad. Inconvenience is not necessity. And that powerful Section 62? It's a one-way street. It only helps buyers and tenants. It does nothing for sellers and landlords. So Andros loses his shortcut. He failed to write it into the lease, and the law is not going to bend over backwards to imply it for him. He can no longer use that access road through the farm. So let's look at the final scorecard. Benny, the tenant, wins twice. He gets the billboard and the shed, both thanks to that legal powerhouse, Section 62. Andros, the landlord, loses his shortcut because he just couldn't meet the super strict test for an implied reservation. This whole thing just goes to show how critical it is to get every single right down in writing. And what this whole story really leaves us with is a huge question for anyone dealing with property. The land you're about to buy or rent might come with hidden rights that you can benefit from or hidden burdens you'll have to put up with. And as Andros and Benny's story shows us all too clearly, what isn't written down doesn't just go away. It can become the very thing that turns good neighbors into legal enemies.